From Deloitte Tax and Legal Japan, welcome to the Japan Perspective. This is a podcast where we speak to specialists from across Deloitte to discuss the latest business issues impacting foreign multinational companies in Japan. I'm your host, Marie Kodal. Joining us today is David Bickle. David is a partner with over 20 years of experience in our business tax services group here at Deloitte Tokyo. He advises large foreign multinational companies in Japan on their Japanese and cross-border tax issues. Today, we'll be discussing Tax Operate, which has been gaining a lot of traction recently, particularly in Japan. Thank you very much for joining us today, David.
Thank you, Marie. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'd like us to focus today on why we are hearing more about Tax Operate in Japan. Now, before we dive into this, I think defining a few terms would help set the stage for our discussion. So, David, when we talk about Tax Operate, what exactly are we referring to?
Well, we're looking at the tax operations that companies need to conduct and the different tasks and processes that must be undertaken to get those tax operations done, and particularly how companies will arrange to have the capabilities to deliver those processes, so around people, technology. And when we talk about tax operations, we mean things like tax compliance, which is the preparation and filing of tax returns, also tax advisory, transfer pricing, payroll, trade and customs, etc., things like that.
Okay, so it's primarily about the resourcing arrangements, the so-called model, for accomplishing these tasks.
Yes, that's right. But when companies now think about their operating model, they tend to think not only about human resources, their people and talent, but also about how to combine those resources, the human resources, with technology and also the implications of the future of work as well.
That makes sense. And so companies could choose to be using a mix of in-house resources along with some outsourced support from external providers.
Yeah, exactly. And you've touched on a couple of the common operating models there. So traditionally, companies insourced their tax operations, meaning that they had tax leadership, which was making key strategic decisions about the tax operations. And the people handling the tasks and doing the work, the kind of the tax production, if you like, were all employed by the company. Then over time, companies introduced technology and automated certain processes, and some even started to use shared service centers within their wider group. But essentially, this was still an insourcing model using in-house staff and technology that they had developed themselves or purchased and implemented themselves.
I see. So what happens when outsourcing these operations?
Well, with outsourcing, the leadership and ultimate responsibility still remain within the company, and that doesn't change. But the responsibility for some of the tax operations, and commonly the tax compliance function, is given over to an external service provider who then takes responsibility for automating and delivering the processes and tasks that make up that particular tax operation. And in this case, the external provider would be using its own staff and likely also its own technology to do that work.
Okay, so what is Tax Operate then?
Yeah, well, Tax Operate is another kind of operating model for combining human resources and technology, where the tax operations are substantially, if not even entirely, handled by an external provider. Again, ultimate leadership, tax leadership and decision-making remains within the company, but technology is provided externally. And again, it's people from outside of the company who are performing the tasks to deliver the tax operations. And in this case, the external service provider effectively becomes an extension of the company's organization, if you like.
Thank you for clarifying. So which operating model is best for companies?
Well, it depends a lot on their culture and the demands of their organization, which are, of course, unique to each different company. But there are discernible trends that we're seeing that are causing certain companies to look more closely at Tax Operate, the Tax Operate version of the model.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to those trends in a moment, particularly for Japan. But before that, what kind of things cause companies to make or at least consider a change to their tax operating model?
I mean, it depends on the circumstances of the company, but drivers for change certainly include things like technological advancement and innovation, requiring significant investment in hardware, software, and training just to keep up with the tech advance. Also, resource constraints due to budget cuts and downsizing, basically being asked to do more with less. Economic uncertainty, and also corporate life events such as M&A related, which can bring new ownership and management and new expectations for governance and how to operate within the acquired organization.
That makes sense. So when you say doing more with less, are you essentially referring to the drive to save costs?
Yeah, well, cost saving is an important part of it, but it's certainly not everything. And it's not just about having the right number of people, but rather about having the right kind of people. So the right kind of people with the right tax technical skill set, for example, the experience to leverage increasingly sophisticated IT, the ability to master and deploy knowledge of new and complex regulation, and the ability to interpret large data sets.
I see. So it does seem like companies are increasingly recognizing these benefits, especially with the introduction of the new Pillar 2 rules.
Yeah, exactly. And Pillar 2 is a great example of an issue that's certainly prompting businesses to consider how they can get access to the knowledge and skills that they require in a way that is stable, reliable, and also at minimized cost. So it's really a question of efficiency, which is not necessarily the same as the lowest cost. And companies are basically now faced with a buy or build decision. Now, I know that in an ideal world, many CFOs and tax directors would perhaps prefer to have everything in-house, where they know that the talent has deep knowledge of their own business and is equipped with all the skills and resources they need to deliver the functions that are relevant to their own business. But the costs of doing this are far greater than just salary and benefits of the people. There's also the ongoing cost of the commitment to training them and the cost of licensing increasingly advanced technology that may be necessary to help handle these tax processes. Now, a tax operate model can help address the knowledge gap that can otherwise open up when businesses switch from insourcing to outsourcing, as operate engagements are typically longer term commitments whereby service providers are going to commit to take over the operations for a number of years, could be several years. And during that time, they're going to get the opportunity to accumulate the company specific knowledge, that knowledge about how the taxpayer operates themselves. And in the process, they may even recruit the tax function talent from that company. And so when you consider all of these costs, it can be cheaper and more effective to buy in that capability rather than to use up scarce time, effort, and money in trying to build that same capability completely within-house.
So many of these considerations you just mentioned seem quite generic, but I'm sure there are some unique issues that are driving the tax operate conversation in Japan. Could you tell us about those Japan-specific issues?
Yeah, certainly. And definitely all the things we've talked about so far are relevant to the evaluation of operating models in Japan. Over the last few years, though, the tightness of the labor market within Japan, I think, has been a particular factor. And so just to illustrate, for example, applicants to sit the licensed tax accountant exam, the Zeirishi exam, slumped between 2012 and 2020. And whilst the numbers have started to rise again, this hollowing out of the talent pipeline has contributed to a lack of experienced practitioners, which inevitably makes the recruitment of in-house talent more of a challenge. And that challenge is multiplied in Japan when you consider that most inbound businesses are looking for people that not only have the necessary tax technical skills, but also, again, particularly in the case of Japan, that have bilingual or multilingual communication ability too.
That's interesting. Thank you. Is there anything else that is driving the trend in addition to talent shortage? For example, are there any tax technical issues arising out of changes to the tax law?
Yeah, I think there are, and probably a good example is the Electronic Record Retention Law, or the ERRL, that we saw come into force at the beginning of this year. And just as a reminder, the ERRL caused many businesses to think more deeply about the detailed tasks and processes that are bundled up to make up tax operations, and whether they, as taxpayers, are appropriately set up to comply, and whether they have the people on hand with the required mix of tax and technology skills to conduct an assessment of such matters as well. So in addition to ERRL, we also had qualified invoicing, which is part of a multi-year reform of Japan's indirect tax system. And that has caused businesses to consider their indirect tax processes and how they get prepared, or are still preparing for such changes. And also whether they want to expend the energy to learn and train and transform their people, or whether simply they'd like to find an external provider that can deliver the JCT operations in this new world of indirect tax, that can deliver the JCT operations for them.
Yeah, so it seems like with these new laws and regulations that companies in Japan are facing, the tax operate model would definitely relieve some of the pressure there. You mentioned a moment ago finding people with the right language skills being crucial but challenging in Japan. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, finding people locally in Japan with the right language skills to interact with new leadership and stakeholders, and who must not only have the language skills, but must also be happy and confident to work within the governance expectations of new owners is definitely a challenge. And this frequently occurs when previously autonomous Japanese businesses come under foreign ownership, and which is why we mention M&A and lifestyle events as one of the drivers of tax operating.
Right. Having bilingual skills is definitely key in international environments. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share on tax operate?
Well, I think just to say that I think the capstone reason for why companies should consider tax operate, and this is something we've heard a lot about this decade since the pandemic, is actually to achieve greater resilience. And ultimately, even if the answer to the buy versus build equation is to not outsource but to build in-house, that's nevertheless in all cases likely to be quite a brittle solution, particularly if a company recruits a dedicated local tax manager, allocating the budget they have available to the salary for that one person. It's quite possible that person will gain knowledge and become a very valued operator and team member, until that is, of course, they decide to leave, and then the business is basically back to square one, scrambling again to deliver on the tax operations. So certainly external providers have deeper pools of talent from which to deploy hard to find skill sets, desirable skill sets. So the tax operate solution is arguably more resilient, and also provides access to the resources and capabilities of much larger professional services firms. And it also frees up, importantly, it frees up the time of tax leadership within the company to focus on the tasks that they want to be doing. So on being genuinely commercially focused advisors to their own business. And that's something I think that the other functions within the business are increasingly expecting of the tax function.
Those are really great points to consider. Thank you for that. Before we conclude today's episode, can you tell us how companies can find out more about tax operate?
Yeah, well, in my experience, it basically begins with a conversation, much like this one, a conversation to understand priorities and needs and expectations. And when doing that, I often find it helpful to lead that conversation around to a list of the more granular tasks and procedures that we typically see tax functions dealing with. And then to ask taxpayers what resonates with them, which tasks do they recognize as currently being handled in-house within their organization, and whether any of those are particular pain points for them. Then from there, to consider whether a tax operate type of operating model, where an external provider takes over some of those processes, might provide a better, more efficient, and more resilient way of delivering those tax operations for tax and finance leadership going forward.
That's very helpful. All right, well, thank you so much, David. I think that brings us to the end of today's episode. And thank you very much to our listeners for tuning in. We hope you found this valuable. Lastly, thanks for the feedback provided on this podcast through our survey link, which you can find in this episode's description section. You can find episodes of The Japan Perspective on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and X. Thanks again, and have a great day.